The night my life changed started with the worst ride of my life and a man I thought was just a driver. The rain had been falling for hours, the kind of steady spring rain that turned the streets of Chicago into mirrors of blurred streetlights and passing headlights. My shoes were soaked through, my mascara had probably surrendered 20 minutes ago, and my phone screen glowed with the rideshare app that promised a car was 2 minutes away. 2 minutes felt like a lifetime when you were standing outside a wedding venue that had just fired you in front of 200 guests. I wrapped my thin jacket tighter around my shoulders and tried not to think about the moment my manager had pulled me aside, his voice polite but final, telling me they needed someone more experienced handling high-profile events. Experienced apparently meant someone who didn't accidentally spill sparkling water on a table of investors from New York. My bank account had $43 left in it. My rent was due in 10 days. And the man I had dated for 3 years had texted me that morning to say he thought we should take a break. I laughed quietly under my breath at the memory, the sound disappearing into the rain as a black sedan rolled smoothly to the curb in front of me. The window lowered halfway. "Emily Carter?" the driver asked. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that didn't belong to someone working the night shift. "That's me," I said, pulling open the door and sliding into the back seat. The interior smelled faintly like leather and something expensive I couldn't name. The heat was on, warm air wrapping around my frozen hands as I rubbed them together. "Long night?" the driver asked as he pulled away from the curb. I caught a glimpse of his eyes in the rearview mirror. Dark, observant, the kind of eyes that notice things. "You could say that," I replied. For a few minutes we drove in silence, the windshield wipers moving in slow rhythm while downtown lights streaked across the glass like watercolor. He drove differently than most rideshare drivers I'd had. Smooth, confident, every turn precise, every lane change deliberate, like he knew the road before it even appeared. I leaned my head against the cool window and watched the city slide past. "Do you ever feel like the world only works for certain people?" I asked suddenly, surprising even myself. He glanced at me again in the mirror. "What do you mean?" "You know," I said with a tired shrug. "The people with money, connections, the ones who fly private and never have to worry about rent or getting fired over a glass of water." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, barely visible in the reflection. "Private jets, huh?" he said. "Just an example." "And you think those people have easier lives?" he asked. I scoffed softly. "Let's just say I wouldn't mind finding out." The rain grew heavier as we merged onto Lakeshore Drive, traffic thinning as midnight approached. The city skyline glowed ahead of us like a field of gold and glass. "What's your name?" I asked after a moment. "Adrian," he said. "Nice to meet you, Adrian," I replied, closing my eyes briefly as the warmth of the car finally began to thaw the cold out of my bones. If someone had told me then that the quiet driver behind the wheel wasn't just another guy working a late shift, but a man whose name was written on buildings, companies, and a private jet waiting at an airport outside the city, I would have laughed. Because at that moment, Adrian was just my ride home. And I had no idea that by the end of the night, nothing about my life would look the same again. I did not realize how quiet the car had become until the sound of the rain was the only thing filling the space between us. Adrian drove with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the city lights reflecting across the windshield in long golden lines that stretched toward the dark water of Lake Michigan. The heater hummed softly, and the warmth made my exhaustion settle deeper into my bones. For a moment I considered apologizing for rambling earlier, but something about the calm way he drove made the silence feel natural instead of awkward. "So," I said eventually, glancing toward the mirror again, "how long have you been doing this?" Adrian did not answer immediately. The sedan moved smoothly through a green light, tires whispering against the wet pavement. "Driving?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Rides, I mean." A small pause followed. "Long enough," he replied. That was not really an answer, but his voice carried a quiet confidence that made it sound like one. I watched the passing buildings outside my window. Downtown Chicago at midnight had a strange beauty to it. Offices that looked cold and imposing during the day now glowed softly with scattered lights from people working late or security guards making their rounds. "You seem very calm," I said after another minute. "Most drivers I get are either tired, talking on the phone, or trying to convince me to rate them 5 stars. Adrian smiled faintly. "Are you saying I should ask for 5 stars? If you do not crash the car, You probably deserve them, I said with a tired laugh. His eyes met mine briefly in the mirror again. There was something thoughtful in his expression, something that suggested he was studying people more than simply driving them from one place to another. Bad night? He asked gently. I hesitated, then shrugged. I lost my job tonight. The words sounded smaller when spoken out loud. I am sorry to hear that, he said. It happens, I replied quickly. People like me are easy to replace. Adrian tilted his head slightly. People like you? People who serve drinks and hope someone tips enough to cover groceries, I said. People who stand in rooms full of millionaires and pretend we belong there. The rain intensified, drumming softly across the roof of the car. Adrian slowed slightly as we approached a stretch of road where traffic lights reflected in the wet pavement like scattered jewels. Belonging is a strange idea, he said quietly. Sometimes the people who look like they belong the most are the ones pretending. I frowned a little at that. You sound like someone who knows those rooms. Maybe I do, he replied. His tone was calm, but there was something behind it that I could not quite place. Curiosity stirred in my chest. So what is your story then, Adrian? I asked. Driver by night, philosopher by midnight. He chuckled softly. Something like that. I leaned back again, watching the rain blur the skyline ahead. The car continued along Lakeshore Drive, the lake stretching into darkness beside us. For a moment, everything felt strangely peaceful, like the night had wrapped the city in a quiet pause. Then Adrian's eyes flicked to the side mirror again. The movement was subtle, but I noticed it. Once. Then again. His posture changed almost imperceptibly, his attention sharpening in a way that made the atmosphere inside the car shift. I followed his gaze toward the mirror, but could only see the glow of headlights somewhere behind us in the rain. Is everything okay? I asked. Adrian did not answer immediately. The sedan continued forward, smooth and controlled, but the calm rhythm of the drive had changed. Probably nothing, he said after a moment. His voice remained steady, yet something about it made my stomach tighten slightly, because the way he said probably sounded less like reassurance and more like someone deciding whether to tell the truth. For a few seconds I tried to convince myself that the feeling in my stomach was just leftover anxiety from the night I had already had. Chicago traffic at midnight could be unpredictable. Maybe the headlights behind us simply belonged to another car heading the same direction along Lakeshore Drive. But Adrian kept checking the mirror, and the subtle tension in his shoulders told a different story. The sedan continued moving smoothly through the rain, the tires cutting quietly across the wet asphalt as the skyline stretched across the dark horizon. I leaned slightly forward in my seat and glanced toward the rear window. At first I saw nothing unusual, just blurred lights and reflections sliding across the glass like streaks of gold and white. Then the shape of a dark sport utility vehicle appeared behind us, its headlights steady even as the rain thickened. That car has been behind us for a while, I said casually. Adrian did not answer immediately. His eyes moved once more to the mirror before returning to the road. Probably just heading the same direction, he said calmly. His voice sounded controlled, but the way his fingers adjusted on the steering wheel made me notice something. He was paying very close attention. The sport utility vehicle stayed several car lengths back, never getting too close and never falling too far behind. At the next intersection, Adrian turned right, leaving the main road and moving onto a quieter street lined with dark apartment buildings. The traffic lights here blinked yellow, casting soft reflections across puddles on the pavement. I glanced back again. The same headlights turned with us. My stomach tightened slightly. That is a coincidence, I said slowly. Adrian did not respond. Instead, he made another turn 2 blocks later, this time onto a narrow street that curved toward the north side of the city. The sedan moved effortlessly, engine barely making a sound. I watched the rear window again. The headlights followed. Okay, I said, sitting up straighter. Either that person is also very lost, or they are definitely following us. Adrian exhaled quietly through his nose. Not annoyed, not surprised, just thoughtful. It might be nothing, he said, but we will know soon. He accelerated slightly, guiding the car back toward a larger boulevard where the streetlights stood tall above the empty lanes. The rain softened to a gentle mist, turning the air outside silver under the lamps. The sport utility vehicle emerged behind us again. Still there, still steady. I felt a strange mixture of curiosity and unease. Do you know them? I asked. Adrian glanced at the mirror again, then shook his head once. Not personally. The answer made my pulse jump. That is not comforting, I said. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, but his eyes remained focused. Relax, he said calmly. Nothing has happened. The sedan continued forward, passing through another intersection. For a moment, I thought perhaps the other vehicle would keep going straight and disappear into the night. Instead, its headlights remained fixed behind us like two quiet stars in the rain. Adrian slowed slightly as we approached a fork in the road. Instead of heading toward the residential neighborhoods that would eventually lead to my apartment, he guided the car onto a wide highway ramp that curved away from the city lights. I looked around in confusion. Adrian, I said carefully, my place is not this way. He nodded once without taking his eyes off the road. I know, he replied. Then where are we going? The ramp straightened, leading toward a stretch of road that ran alongside a chain-link fence and a field of distant runway lights blinking red and white in the darkness. Adrian's voice remained calm, almost reassuring. Somewhere safer. The moment Adrian said the word safer, I felt a quiet wave of confusion settle over me. Outside the windshield, the road stretched forward in a long curve, and the glow of the city behind us faded into a soft golden haze against the night sky. Ahead, the blinking red lights I had noticed earlier grew brighter, standing tall above what looked like an enormous open field. It took my brain a few seconds to understand what I was seeing. Runway lights. My heart skipped slightly. Adrian, I said slowly, leaning forward in my seat. That looks like an airport. It is, he replied calmly. The sedan moved through a wide access road bordered by tall chain-link fences, the kind you only saw around restricted areas. My confusion turned into something sharper. Why are we going to an airport? I asked. Adrian did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced in the mirror once more, then eased the car toward a small security gate where a single overhead lamp cast a circle of pale light onto the pavement. I turned around instinctively. The dark sport utility vehicle was still there in the distance, its headlights glowing softly through the mist. My pulse quickened again. They are still behind us, I said quietly. Adrian nodded once. I noticed. The sedan rolled to a gentle stop in front of the gate. For a brief moment, everything was quiet except for the soft hum of the engine and the faint ticking sound of rain touching the hood of the car. Then something strange happened. The gate began to slide open. No security guard appeared. No one stepped outside to check identification. The metal barrier simply moved aside like it had been waiting for us all along. I stared at it in disbelief. Did you call ahead or something? I asked. Adrian guided the car forward through the opening without hesitation. Something like that, he replied. The access road beyond the gate led into a wide private terminal area lit by tall floodlights that turned the rain into silver threads falling from the sky. Small buildings stood along one side of the pavement, sleek and modern with dark glass walls reflecting the runway lights. Everything looked quiet, almost too quiet. Adrian slowed the sedan as we approached a large open section of tarmac. At first I thought the space was empty. Then I saw it. A jet, not a small charter plane. A real private jet, sleek and white with polished wings stretching out under the floodlights like something out of a movie. The aircraft rested quietly on the runway apron as if it had been waiting for someone important to arrive. My mouth opened slightly before I could stop myself. That cannot be for us, I said under my breath. Adrian did not respond. Instead, he parked the sedan about 30 yards from the aircraft and switched off the engine. The sudden silence made the rain sound louder against the windshield. I looked from the jet to Adrian and back again. Adrian, I said slowly. I think you accidentally drove me into the wrong airport. He turned slightly in his seat then, finally facing me fully for the first time since the ride began. His expression was calm, completely calm, like none of this was unusual. No, he said gently. We are exactly where we are supposed to be. I blinked at him, trying to understand what he meant. Then I noticed something written along the side of the aircraft near the tail where the floodlights illuminated the lettering clearly. 2 words in bold silver letters that reflected the light like polished steel. Volkov Aviation. My eyes widened as I looked back at Adrian again, because suddenly the quiet driver sitting in front of me did not seem like just a driver anymore. I stared at the words on the side of the aircraft like my brain needed extra time to translate them into something that made sense. Volkov Aviation. The silver letters gleamed under the runway lights, sharp and deliberate, like the name belonged to someone who did not hide behind modesty. My eyes slowly moved from the jet back to Adrian sitting in the driver's seat. He had not moved. His hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, his posture relaxed, as if parking beside a private aircraft in the middle of the night was just another normal stop on his route. "Adrian," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please tell me you did not accidentally drive your rideshare passenger on someone else's private runway." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not mocking, just patient. I did not. I looked back at the aircraft again. The jet was larger than anything I had ever been close to in my life. Sleek, white, polished so perfectly that the lights of the runway reflected along its body like streaks of liquid silver. A set of mobile stairs stood ready beside the door, already lowered. The entire scene looked like something from a billionaire documentary or a movie about corporate executives who lived in a completely different universe from the one I knew. "Then whose plane is that?" I asked. Adrian turned the key slightly to switch off the remaining electronics in the car. The dashboard lights faded, leaving only the glow of the runway illuminating the interior. For a moment he did not answer. Instead, he opened the driver's side door and stepped out into the rain. The door closed softly behind him. I blinked in disbelief and quickly opened my own door, stepping out onto the wet pavement. The air was cooler here, carrying the distant smell of fuel and fresh rain. Adrian walked a few steps toward the jet, then stopped and turned back to look at me. The runway lights outlined his silhouette, giving him a calm, almost unreal presence against the dark sky. "Adrian," I said again, following him a few steps. "You still have not answered my question." He glanced briefly toward the road behind the fence where faint headlights could still be seen in the distance, then returned his attention to me. His voice remained calm when he finally spoke. "The plane belongs to me." For a second my brain refused to process the sentence. I laughed automatically because it sounded like the kind of joke someone made after a long day. "Right?" I said, shaking my head. "And I own the Chicago skyline." Adrian did not laugh. He simply watched me with that same steady expression he had worn all night. "Emily," he said gently, "look at the name again." I turned toward the jet once more. "Volkov Aviation." Slowly, my mind replayed the moment from earlier when I had asked his name during the drive. "Adrian. Just Adrian." I turned back toward him, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. "Volkov," I said quietly. Adrian nodded once. The realization hit me like a sudden shift in gravity. "You are telling me," I said slowly, pointing toward the plane and then back at him, "that the driver who picked me up 20 minutes ago is the same person whose name is printed on that jet." The rain fell softly between us, silver under the floodlights. Adrian's voice stayed calm when he answered, "Yes." I stood there in complete silence for a few seconds, trying to fit that answer into the reality I understood. Because the quiet man who had been driving me through the rain and discussing life like a philosopher did not look like the kind of person who owned an aircraft waiting on a private runway. Yet everything around us suddenly made more sense. The gate that had opened without question. The empty terminal. The jet that looked ready to depart. I exhaled slowly and ran a hand through my damp hair. "Okay," I said softly, still staring at him in disbelief. "So either I am having the strangest night of my life, or you are not just a driver." Adrian met my gaze calmly. "No," he said, "I am not." For several seconds, I simply stood there under the cold glow of the runway lights, trying to process the quiet certainty in Adrian's voice. The rain had slowed to a soft mist that drifted across the empty tarmac, and the only sounds were the distant hum of airport equipment and the faint clicking of cooling metal from the sedan behind us. Nothing about the moment felt real. 20 minutes earlier, I had been standing outside a wedding venue worrying about how to pay rent. Now I was standing beside a private jet with a man who claimed it belonged to him. I crossed my arms slightly, partly because the night air had turned colder and partly because my brain was trying to hold on to something logical. "You realize how strange that sounds, right?" I said slowly. Adrian nodded once. "Yes. You picked me up as a rideshare driver." I continued, gesturing toward the car behind us. "You were literally driving people around Chicago tonight." "That is correct," he replied calmly. I stared at him. "Why?" Adrian looked toward the jet for a moment, as if considering how to explain something that did not fit easily into normal conversation. Then he returned his attention to me. Sometimes it is useful to see the city without everyone recognizing you, he said. I blinked. So your solution is to drive strangers around? It gives perspective, he answered. The matter-of-fact way he said it made me shake my head in disbelief. Most billionaires buy expensive hobbies, I said. Golf. Yachts. Not pretending to be a driver. Adrian smiled faintly, but did not argue. For a moment neither of us spoke. I looked again at the jet, the polished surface reflecting the floodlights across the wide, empty runway. My eyes returned to the road beyond the fence where those distant headlights still glowed faintly through the mist. The same vehicle that had followed us through the city. The strange feeling in my stomach returned immediately. Those people back there, I said quietly. Are they here because of you? Adrian followed my gaze toward the distant lights. His expression remained calm, but more focused now. Most likely. My heart skipped again. That is not the answer I wanted. He turned slightly toward me. You are safe here. You sound very confident about that. Adrian gestured lightly toward the aircraft. We will not be here long. The words made me pause. We? I repeated. Adrian studied me for a moment like he was deciding how much to say. Emily, he said gently. The people following us probably saw you get into my car tonight. I frowned. So from their perspective, he continued calmly, you are now associated with me. I stared at him as the meaning of that sentence slowly settled into place. You are saying they think I am part of whatever world you belong to. Adrian did not deny it. My laugh came out softer this time, almost disbelieving. That is ridiculous, I said. I spilled sparkling water at a wedding reception tonight. That is the most dangerous thing I have done all week. Adrian's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained steady. Unfortunately, he said quietly, they do not know that. I looked back toward the faint headlights beyond the fence again. Then I looked at the jet waiting behind Adrian like it had been prepared long before I ever stepped into his car. The realization made my chest tighten just a little. Adrian, I said slowly, please tell me you are not about to suggest that the safest place for me tonight is on that plane. Adrian held my gaze calmly in the silver rain. I believe it is. For a moment, I simply stared at Adrian, trying to decide if he was serious or if the entire night had finally crossed into some kind of surreal dream. The private jet loomed quietly behind him under the runway lights, its polished surface reflecting silver streaks of rain that drifted through the air. My brain struggled to connect the calm man standing in front of me with the reality surrounding us. 20 minutes earlier, he had been a rideshare driver navigating wet Chicago streets. Now he was calmly suggesting that boarding a private aircraft was the safest option for my evening. I let out a slow breath and shook my head. You cannot be serious, I said quietly. Adrian did not look offended. He simply watched me with the same steady patience he had shown all night. I am, he replied. I glanced again toward the distant road beyond the fence where the faint headlights of the vehicle that had followed us still glowed through the mist. The lights had stopped moving now, lingering somewhere near the outer gate like someone deciding what to do next. My stomach tightened again. Adrian, I said carefully, I got into your car because I needed a ride home. I did not sign up for whatever this is. He nodded slightly. I understand that. Do you? I asked. Because right now you are asking me to get on a plane with a man I met less than half an hour ago. Adrian considered that for a moment before answering. That is a fair point. The calm way he said it almost made me laugh again, but the tension in the air kept the humor from reaching my voice. I folded my arms against the cold and looked toward the aircraft again. The mobile stairs were still waiting beside the open door, illuminated by soft lights along the fuselage. The entire scene felt too prepared, like something that had been arranged long before my chaotic night ever began. Where would that plane even go? I asked quietly. Adrian glanced toward the jet, then back at me. Somewhere quiet, he said. Somewhere the people following us cannot reach you. The words hung between us in the cool night air. I studied his expression carefully, searching for any sign that he was exaggerating or trying to manipulate the situation. Instead, I found the same calm honesty I had noticed earlier when he spoke about perspective and belonging. You really believe they would come after me just because I sat in your car? I said. Adrian nodded once. It is possible. That is unbelievable, I muttered. Your life seems to attract very strange problems. That is one way to describe it, he replied. I took a few slow steps across the wet pavement, staring up at the massive aircraft again. I had never even been inside a private plane before. My entire experience with air travel consisted of cramped airline seats and delayed flights to visit family during holidays. The idea of stepping into that jet felt like crossing into someone else's world entirely. I turned back toward Adrian. "And if I say no?" I asked. He did not hesitate. "Then I will drive you home." I blinked in surprise. "Just like that?" "Yes." I studied him carefully again. There was no pressure in his voice, no demand, just a calm offer and the quiet expectation that I would decide for myself. The rain continued to fall softly around us as the distant headlights beyond the fence shifted slightly in the darkness. I looked from those lights back to the aircraft, then finally to Adrian, the quiet driver who turned out to be something much more complicated than I ever expected. I exhaled slowly. "You know," I said softly, "this is not how I imagined tonight ending." Adrian's expression softened slightly. "Life rarely follows our expectations," he replied. I looked at the stairs leading into the jet one more time. Then I asked the only question that still mattered. "If I step onto that plane," I said quietly, "does my normal life disappear the moment the door closes?" Adrian watched me carefully before answering. "Not unless you choose to let it." The rain continued to fall softly around the runway, turning the floodlights into glowing halos in the night air. I stood there for a long moment staring at the stairs that led into the private jet, feeling like I was standing at the edge of a decision that was far bigger than it should have been. Part of me wanted to laugh, turn around, and ask Adrian to simply drive me home so I could crawl into my small apartment and pretend none of this had ever happened. That was the life I understood. Rent payments, late shifts, cheap takeout, and rideshare cars that smelled like air freshener and coffee. This jet belonged to a completely different world. I looked back toward the fence again, where the distant headlights still hovered in the darkness like quiet watchers. The vehicle had not left. It had simply stopped somewhere beyond the gate, waiting. A strange chill moved through my chest. "They are still there," I said quietly. Adrian followed my gaze for a moment before nodding once. "Yes. They are really not giving up easily," I muttered. Adrian's voice remained calm. "People who spend time following others rarely do." I let out a slow breath and rubbed my hands together against the cool air. "This might be the strangest decision I have ever had to make," I said softly. Adrian did not interrupt. He simply waited. That patience somehow made the moment feel even more serious. I walked slowly toward the aircraft, my shoes making soft sounds against the wet pavement. The jet looked even larger as I approached it, the polished metal reflecting the runway lights across its curved surface like ripples of silver water. I reached the base of the mobile stairs and looked up into the open doorway, where warm interior lights glowed softly. It felt inviting in a way that made the situation even more surreal. I turned back toward Adrian, who had followed a few steps behind me, but stopped at a respectful distance. "If this turns out to be a very elaborate kidnapping story," I said, trying to keep a hint of humor in my voice, "I want it noted that I walked onto the plane voluntarily." Adrian almost smiled. "That would make it a very poor kidnapping," he replied calmly. I studied him for another second, searching again for any sign that this was a bad idea. Instead, I found the same steady presence that had guided me safely through wet city streets earlier that night. Something about him made it difficult to imagine he would let anything truly dangerous happen to me. The realization surprised me more than anything else that had happened tonight. I sighed softly and shook my head. "This is completely insane," I said under my breath. Then I placed my foot on the first step of the staircase and slowly climbed toward the open door of the aircraft. The interior was warm and quiet when I stepped inside, filled with soft lighting and polished wood that made the space feel more like a luxury living room than a plain cabin. Comfortable leather seats lined the walls, and wide windows looked out across the glowing runway. I stood there for a moment taking it all in while rain tapped gently against the fuselage outside. A few seconds later, Adrian stepped inside behind me. The cabin door closed with a soft mechanical sound that echoed through the quiet space. For the first time all night, the outside world disappeared completely. No rain, no distant headlights, just silence and the soft hum of systems powering up somewhere deeper in the aircraft. I slowly turned to face Adrian again. "Okay," I said quietly, glancing around the elegant cabin one more time. "I guess I am officially not having a normal night anymore." Adrian met my gaze calmly. That is one way to describe it. I sank carefully into one of the leather seats and let out a slow breath. So, I said, looking up at him, what exactly happens next? For a moment, neither of us moved. The cabin lights cast a warm golden glow across the polished wood panels and soft leather seats, and the quiet hum of the aircraft systems made the entire space feel strangely peaceful compared to the cold rain outside. I leaned back slowly in the seat, my hands resting on the armrests as my eyes moved across the elegant interior. The seats were wide and comfortable, stitched with dark leather that looked like it belonged in a luxury living room rather than an airplane. A small table stood between the seats, and a row of windows revealed the runway lights stretching across the night like glowing pearls. I exhaled slowly. This plane is nicer than every apartment I have ever lived in, I said quietly. Adrian stepped further into the cabin, closing the small gap between the entryway and the seating area with calm, measured steps. It is designed to be comfortable, he replied. I raised an eyebrow. That is one way to describe it. My gaze drifted back toward the window again. The rain streaked softly across the glass, and beyond it the floodlights of the runway illuminated the wet pavement. Somewhere far in the distance, beyond the airport fence, faint headlights still glowed in the darkness. The car that had followed us had not disappeared yet. My chest tightened slightly. Those people out there, I said quietly, nodding toward the window. They really went through a lot of trouble just to follow you. Adrian stood beside the seat across from me, resting one hand lightly on the back of the chair before sitting down across from me. His posture remained relaxed, but there was a quiet focus in his eyes now. Some people believe persistence solves problems, he said calmly. Even when it does not. I watched him carefully for a moment. Your life sounds complicated, I said. Adrian gave a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes. That is also one way to describe it. A soft vibration moved through the cabin floor as the aircraft systems continued preparing quietly in the background. The sound was subtle but steady, like the plane itself was slowly waking up. I shifted slightly in the seat. So this thing is actually going to take off, I said. Adrian nodded once. Yes. I blinked at him. Just like that? No paperwork. No airport lines. No one asking me to remove my shoes. Adrian almost laughed. Private aviation tends to skip those parts. I shook my head slowly, still absorbing the surreal nature of the moment. I cannot believe I got fired tonight, and somehow ended up boarding a private jet with a man I met in a rideshare car. Adrian studied me for a moment before speaking again. You could still change your mind, he said gently. The plane has not left yet. I looked toward the cabin door behind him. For a second, I imagined standing up, walking back down the stairs, and asking him to simply drive me home like none of this had happened. But the image felt strangely distant now, like a version of the night that belonged to someone else. Instead, I leaned back in the seat again and let out a quiet breath. If I get off the plane, I said slowly, those people outside might still be waiting. Adrian nodded once. Possibly. And if I stay? I asked. Then we leave Chicago for a little while, he replied calmly. I looked back out the window at the rain and glowing runway lights stretching across the darkness. My normal life suddenly felt very far away. I turned my attention back to Adrian again. You realize that if my friends hear about this story, I said quietly, they will assume I completely lost my mind. Adrian leaned back slightly in his seat, calm as ever. Or, he said, they might believe you had the most interesting night of your life. I considered that for a moment, then gave a quiet, uncertain laugh. You know what? I said softly, glancing once more at the rain-covered window. I think you might be right about that. The quiet hum. Inside the cabin deepened slightly, a low steady vibration that traveled through the floor beneath my feet and into the seat where I sat. I looked toward the windows again and noticed that the runway lights seemed a little brighter now, reflecting across the wet pavement in long glowing lines. Somewhere outside the aircraft a set of engines had begun preparing for departure. The realization made my stomach flutter with a strange mixture of nerves and excitement. Adrian seemed completely unaffected by it. He sat across from me with the same calm posture he had maintained since the moment I stepped into his car earlier that night, as if flying away from Chicago in the middle of a rainy evening was just another item on his schedule. I leaned slightly toward the window and watched as a small airport vehicle drove slowly across the tarmac before disappearing behind a hangar. The rain had softened into a fine mist, turning the floodlights into shimmering halos in the darkness. "So we are really leaving," I said quietly. Adrian followed my gaze toward the window for a moment before nodding. "Yes." I sat back again and crossed my arms loosely, trying to process the reality of the situation. "Do you do this often?" I asked. "Pick up strangers and take them on unexpected flights across the country?" Adrian smiled faintly. "No," he said. "This situation is unusual." "That is comforting," I replied dryly. The soft vibration beneath the cabin floor grew slightly stronger as the aircraft systems continued preparing for departure. I could feel the faint movement of hydraulic systems adjusting somewhere beneath the fuselage, like the plane itself was stretching before waking fully. My eyes moved across the interior again. Everything about the cabin felt carefully designed. The lighting was warm but soft, the seats wide and comfortable, the polished surfaces reflecting just enough light to make the space feel open rather than enclosed. It felt less like transportation and more like a quiet lounge floating above the runway. I glanced back at Adrian again. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked. Adrian folded his hands loosely in front of him, considering the question for a moment. "Somewhere quieter than Chicago," he said. "That is not very specific." "It does not need to be," he replied calmly. I shook my head slightly and let out a small laugh. "You realize most people do not get on planes without knowing the destination." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Most people do not get followed across the city by mysterious vehicles either." I paused at that and glanced toward the window again. The distant headlights beyond the airport fence were no longer visible now, hidden by buildings and the angle of the runway lights. The outside world felt very far away from the quiet comfort of the cabin. "I suppose you have a point," I admitted. A moment later, the entire aircraft shifted gently, as if the wheels had begun rolling forward. The movement was smooth and controlled, but unmistakable. I felt the change immediately and looked back toward Adrian with raised eyebrows. "That felt like motion," I said. Adrian nodded once. "We are taxiing." I leaned toward the window again, just in time to see the runway lights begin sliding slowly past the glass. The aircraft moved steadily along the tarmac, guided by glowing lines of light that stretched into the darkness ahead. My heart beat a little faster as the reality of the moment fully settled in. "You know," I said softly while watching the lights drift past. "Earlier tonight, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was losing my job." Adrian watched me with quiet curiosity. "And now?" I turned my head toward him again, a faint smile forming despite the surreal nature of the night. "Now I am flying somewhere unknown with a man who pretended to be my driver." Adrian's expression remained calm, but thoughtful. "Technically," he said, "I did drive you." I laughed quietly and leaned back into the leather seat again as the aircraft continued rolling toward the runway. That might be the most literal technicality I have ever heard. Outside the windows, the runway stretched ahead into the darkness like a glowing path across the night sky, and for the first time I realized there was no turning back now. The aircraft rolled steadily along the taxiway, the runway lights drifting past the windows like long strings of glowing pearls in the darkness. I pressed my shoulder gently against the seat and watched the city fade behind us, the skyline of Chicago now only a distant shimmer of gold against the night sky. The soft vibration beneath the cabin floor grew stronger as the engines powered up and the quiet lounge like calm off. The cabin shifted into something more alive. It felt like the plane itself was taking a deep breath before the moment that would send us into the air. I wrapped my hands lightly around the armrests and glanced across at Adrian again. He still looked completely relaxed, as if this exact moment had happened 100 times before. His calm made the entire situation feel strangely safe, even though nothing about this night had followed a normal path. "I cannot believe I am actually doing this," I said quietly while watching the runway ahead stretch into the distance. Adrian leaned back slightly in his seat, his eyes moving toward the window for a moment before returning to me. "Most unexpected decisions lead to the most interesting stories," he said. I smiled faintly at that. "That sounds like something a man with a private jet would say." Adrian gave a small shrug. "Possibly." The aircraft turned gently as it reached the end of the taxiway, aligning itself with the long, glowing runway ahead. I could see the lights stretching straight into the darkness like a golden road pointing toward the sky. My heartbeat picked up slightly. The moment felt enormous in a quiet way, like standing at the edge of something new and unknown. Adrian, I said after a moment, my voice softer now, what exactly do you do when you are not pretending to be a driver? He looked thoughtful for a second before answering. I run several companies, he said simply. Volkov Aviation is one of them. I glanced around the luxurious cabin again and nodded slowly. I assumed that part. Adrian continued calmly. Technology, transportation, a few investment groups. I let out a quiet whistle. So you were one of those people I was complaining about earlier. Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. People with private jets? People with power, I said. The aircraft paused briefly at the runway threshold, engines humming steadily, as if gathering strength. Adrian looked out the window toward the endless stretch of lights before answering. Power is often misunderstood, he said quietly. Most people think it means control. In reality, it mostly means responsibility. I studied his expression carefully. The calm seriousness in his voice made the words feel genuine rather than rehearsed. That is a very philosophical answer for someone who owns an aircraft, I said. Adrian gave a faint smile. You asked. A moment later the engines grew louder, and the aircraft began moving forward again, slowly at first, and then steadily faster as it rolled down the runway. The lights outside the windows blurred into streaks of gold as the plane gained speed. My hands tightened slightly on the armrests, a mix of nerves and excitement rising in my chest. The cabin vibrated gently as the powerful engines pushed us forward into the night. I looked at Adrian again as the city lights slipped further behind us. If this is the moment where I should start feeling nervous, I said quietly, it might be happening right now. Adrian met my gaze with the same calm confidence he had shown since the beginning of the ride. That is normal, he said. I turned my attention back to the window as the runway lights rushed past faster and faster beneath us. Then suddenly the pressure shifted and the ground began to fall away. The city lights of Chicago spread beneath us like a glowing map, while the aircraft lifted smoothly into the dark sky above. I let out a slow breath as the plane climbed higher, carrying us away from the rain-soaked runway and the strange night that had started it all. The city of Chicago slowly faded beneath the wings of the aircraft as we climbed higher into the dark sky, the grid of golden lights shrinking into something that looked more like a quiet constellation than a living city. I watched through the wide window beside my seat as the clouds swallowed the last reflection of the rain-soaked streets below. Within a few moments the plane leveled slightly, the engines settling into a steady hum that felt almost soothing after the rush of the takeoff. The cabin lights softened automatically, casting a warm glow across the polished wood and leather interior. It felt strangely peaceful now, like the chaos of the night had been left somewhere far behind on that runway. I leaned back in the seat and let out a slow breath. That was smoother than I expected, I said quietly. Adrian glanced toward the window before returning his attention to me. Private aircraft tend to be more stable, he replied. I nodded slowly and watched the clouds drift past outside the glass like soft silver waves under the moonlight. For the first time all evening my thoughts began to settle enough for the reality of everything to catch up with me. You know, I said after a moment. This morning I woke up thinking my biggest concern was finishing a long shift at a wedding reception. Adrian tilted his head slightly. And now? I looked around the luxurious cabin again before answering. Now I am flying above the clouds with a man who owns a jet and who somehow ended up driving me across Chicago tonight. Adrian gave a faint smile. Life has an interesting sense of timing. I laughed softly at that and shifted in the seat. So tell me something honestly, I said. Why did you really decide to drive tonight? Adrian looked thoughtful for a moment before answering. Sometimes it is useful to observe the world without people reacting to your name or your position, he said calmly. When people think you are just another driver, they speak freely. They are honest in ways they would not normally be. I raised an eyebrow. So I was part of an experiment. Adrian shook his head slightly. No, you were simply someone who happened to request a ride. I watched him carefully for a moment before nodding. Well, if that was your plan, you probably heard more honesty from me than you expected. Adrian smiled faintly. I did. Outside the window the clouds parted briefly, revealing the distant shimmer of towns and highways far below like tiny threads of light across the dark land. The view was beautiful in a quiet way that made the moment feel almost unreal. You know what the strange part is? I said softly while watching the horizon. I should probably feel terrified right now. Adrian studied me with quiet curiosity. But you do not, he said. I shook my head slowly. No, I just feel like my life suddenly stepped onto a completely different path. Adrian leaned back slightly in his seat, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes unexpected paths lead exactly where we are meant to go. I glanced back at him with a small smile. That sounds suspiciously like something a man with several companies and a private aviation business would say. Adrian chuckled quietly. The calm atmosphere in the cabin made the moment feel lighter now, like the tension of the night had slowly dissolved somewhere between the runway and the clouds. I looked out the window one more time as the aircraft continued its smooth climb through the sky. So, I said gently, turning back toward him, when we land wherever we are going, what happens then? Adrian met my gaze calmly before answering. That will depend on what you decide you want next. I considered his words while watching the moonlight reflect across the clouds outside. For the first time since the night began, the future felt completely open. I watched the clouds drift slowly beneath the wings of the aircraft as the quiet hum of the engines carried us deeper into the night sky. The city lights were long gone now, replaced by endless darkness and silver moonlight reflecting across the soft ocean of clouds below us. Everything felt calm inside the cabin, almost too calm for a night that had started with rain, job loss, and a rideshare request. I rested my elbow lightly against the window frame and studied the reflection of the cabin lights in the glass. For the first time all evening, my mind felt clear enough to truly absorb what had happened. Adrian remained seated across from me, relaxed and composed, as though flying through the sky in the middle of the night was simply part of his normal routine. I looked at him thoughtfully for a moment before speaking again. You know something strange, I said quietly. Adrian lifted his eyes toward me with mild curiosity. What is that? I glanced back toward the clouds outside the window. Earlier tonight, I thought the worst possible thing that could happen to me was losing my job. Adrian listened without interrupting. I continued slowly. Now I realized that moment was probably the smallest part of this entire night. Adrian gave a faint nod as if he understood exactly what I meant. Life has a way of rearranging priorities, he said calmly. I smiled softly at that and leaned back deeper into the leather seat. The warmth of the cabin and the steady rhythm of the engines made everything feel strangely comfortable. It was hard to believe that only an hour earlier I had been standing in the rain outside a wedding venue worrying about rent. I still cannot believe you were actually driving rideshare, I said after a moment. Adrian chuckled quietly. It was not the most conventional evening activity. That might be the understatement of the century, I replied. The aircraft continued gliding smoothly through the sky while the clouds shifted slowly beneath us like drifting mountains of silver. I studied Adrian again, noticing the calm confidence that seemed to follow him in every movement. Do you ever get tired of that world you live in? I asked. Adrian tilted his head slightly. Which world? The powerful one, I said. The world where people follow you across a city and private jets wait on runways. Adrian thought about the question for a moment before answering. Sometimes, he admitted quietly. That is part of the reason I drove tonight. I considered that answer while watching the moonlight glow across the clouds outside the window. For a man who owned companies and aircraft, there was something surprisingly grounded about him. Well, I said softly, you certainly picked an unforgettable passenger. Adrian smiled slightly. The feeling is mutual. The cabin grew quiet again for a moment while the aircraft continued its smooth journey through the night sky. I looked out the window one more time and let out a slow breath. Something inside me felt lighter now, like the future had suddenly expanded beyond the narrow path I had been walking before tonight began. I turned back toward Adrian again. When we land, I said thoughtfully, I suppose I could go back to my normal life. Adrian nodded once. You could. I studied him for a moment before smiling faintly. But something tells me this night is not finished yet. Adrian met my gaze with the same calm confidence he had carried since the moment he first opened the car door for me in the rain. No, he said quietly. I do not believe it is. Outside the window, the aircraft continued forward through the endless sky, carrying us toward a destination neither of us had fully explained yet. And for the first time all evening, I realized something important. Sometimes the most unexpected ride can change the direction of an entire life.